over to Missouri. So next is Tom Thompson, who's going to talk a little bit about a project that's going on over there. I'll let you do all the introduction and details.
Okay. Well, thank you all for attending. Can everyone hear me all right? Good? This is the first pasture grazing meeting that we've been to in about 9 or 10 years. So this is kind of the culmination. Chris will remember some of the early conversations about Missouri. We're kind of on a different perspective than y'all east of the Mississippi River or the Great Plains area. I consider Missouri a Great Plains state, even though most people don't. But this is some research that had developed starting back in 2008, and I'll cover more of that as we go along. I first want to mention that this talk I'm giving today is just a large team went into this. Elizabeth Middleton, she's our grassland botanist. She's now left to another position. That kind of built on some of the work that she did early on, and then culminated in the presentation today. I apologize, I'm gonna have to go really, really fast because I have so many slides. I won't get to all of it, but just bear with me and I'll be around and I can address any questions. So anyway, got 4 buckets. Because this is a new group, once again, 9 years, great seeing everyone here, this big of a group. But we'll kind of lay the foundation, the background to why we're doing the study the way that we're doing. And then to focus primarily on the plant community response, because that was a driver for doing this research. But hopefully we'll get some chance to cover the vegetation response and get some input from you all in terms of what we could be doing differently in Missouri to get the objectives that we want to get. So both studies are a long-term project. Early on, MDC committed to both these projects being a long-term project, meaning 15 years, which is great. Because sometimes it takes a while for changes to happen. This last year on the plant community response, we're year 8. The structure study was a year behind. That's year 7. And the main thing that we were interested in is looking at the trade-offs and deciding if how MDC will use pasture grazing on remnants, in this case, high-quality prairie. And being in Missouri, that PBGC, we did have some early people that wanted us to differentiate between native and grazing cattle. We'll get to that too. Remember, different audience in Missouri. So the pasture grazing framework that Elizabeth came up with, and our biometrician Ivan Vining, and then the structure study, which I was running, it's still run, but now I'm running the plant community response, are sister studies. And it's broken into 4 different blocks. This top block is we're interested in the management, the grazing intensity, pasture and grazing. And we're looking at each site individually. We got 4 study sites. Then this middle part, we have our assessment period or assessment collecting data. We have our vegetation composition where we're looking at occupancy and looking at diversity metrics. And then the structure side, we're looking at vegetation structure, primarily patch contrast, so we're creating within the grazing unit, but then also looking at cattle locations, how they're utilizing the most recently burned patch. And then at 5-year intervals, this is where it gets kind of unique in the adaptive management framework, is that we have decision triggers. We're applying those decision triggers to the metrics that we're collecting, and then we're deciding how we, after 5 years, will modify pasture and grazing, continue as we're going, or we might stop it for a while. And then at the end of the 15-year study, we'll kind of evaluate MDC, pasture and grazing within MDC and in Missouri. So this diagram might be familiar to you all. This is the adaptive management framework where you have plan, do, evaluate, and then learn and adjust. And that's what we wanted to do with pasture and grazing in Missouri. And we have a proposal phase. Then we have a unique phase where we develop a priori decision triggers. So before we collect any data, to have transparency between us and external stakeholders, we want to set a priori decision triggers, collect data, and then we evaluate every 5 years. So in Missouri, we have a very passionate prairie enthusiast group. Missouri Prairie Foundation, Native Plant Society, Institute of Botanical Training. These people are very passionate and love prairies in Missouri. And the study that we're doing now is primarily external stakeholder driven. So I love this slide. I have to show this every time. Missouri used to have 15 million acres of prairie. About 35% of Missouri used to be native prairie. Also, there's lots of woodland and savanna. Today, I'm sorry, it might look kind of odd, but the yellow turned to green, and that's fescue. So currently in Missouri, we have less than 1% of the original tallgrass prairie remaining. So you all here in Nebraska are blessed to still have lots of native prairie. Here in Missouri, we don't. And the red dots, those are the remaining historical prairie that we have left. And this block is where our study area is, primarily in the western part of the state. Oh, well, yeah, sorry, that's really hard to see. This should start 2001. So 2001, patch burn used on some of our prairies. 2004, we had a replicated study. And this replicated study kind of led to a lot of contention in Missouri, primarily among those prairie enthusiasts. And a report was produced in 2010, and then we started having comments coming in. This was one of them, is patch burn grazing damaging Missouri's native prairies. Here, you can't see it, but it says MDC recently embarked on a potentially damaging prairie management technique. So that's how patch burn grazing was kind of viewed at this time. They like to show photographs like this, where you had recently burned prairie, your typical calendar prairie, and then on the far side is what happened after a patch burn grazing cycle. You had newspaper articles. Critics fear MDC practices is damaging native tallgrass prairie. You had more sedated kind of points of view. This is a good one from Doug Ladd. Made some really, really good points. The big one here, and this is where our prairie enthusiasts come in, is this bottom line and this kind of global rarity and irreplaceability. And the last sentence says, Missouri's tallgrass prairies are among the most important and rarest subset of temperate grassland, the last vestige of the most productive and diverse phase of tallgrass prairie. And then you even had PowerPoints that came out, or not PowerPoints, but YouTube come out. This was one by Paul Nelson. Once again, focusing on high quality prairie is the main contention, the high quality prairie. So all this kind of led to the decision problem context for this study. Does patch burn grazing with cattle on remnant prairie cause irreparable damage to prairie ecosystems? So after all this contention, we had stakeholder meetings in 2011. And what came out of that was a reoccurring theme: understand long-term response of plant community to patch burn grazing. We hired a grassland botanist. This is Elizabeth that I mentioned. 2012, she had a study. Elizabeth actually moved back to Indiana in 2018, but she kind of got the study started. This is a recent paper that just came out. Her and Ivan Vining, the biometrician, kind of looking at using occupancy. That's one of our metrics. We had lots of stakeholder meetings. This was one at Niawathi Prairie. This is one of the damaged areas from that report. And from all this, what came out of it was still, we're concerned about the plant community. And specifically, not only the plant community and diversity, but individual, long-lived conservative plant species. So then we started the study in 2015. If you'll notice, our decision triggers occurred after the start of the study, which was not what we wanted to happen. And I'll explain that in a minute. And then we have our 5-year assessment period. So our priority decisions were supposed to begin before we even collected data. Because of all the contention, to go back into the room after starting the study, there was no oxygen in the room to sit down with external stakeholders, internal stakeholders, to decide on decision triggers, so it did not happen. So those weren't, whoops. So what's a decision trigger? Now, decision triggers are pre-negotiated commitment made by an agency, in this case NDC, within an adaptive management framework specifying what actions we'll be taking if something happens. And these are kind of written as if-then statements. If this happens, we'll do this. And you can, on the right-hand side, you can kind of view it as a point or zone and the status of some ecological metric that we're trying to stay between. We don't want to cross any thresholds. We want to make sure that we're trying to keep the attribute that we're interested in within a certain level. And the big point with this was we wanted evidence-based management, which would offer a way to improve clarity and transparency between us and external stakeholders and how we're making management decisions. And this will fill a critical gap in the evidence-based conservation, helping to close the loop between monitoring and how we're doing management action. So once again, it didn't happen until here. And I'll get to that in a minute. So once again, we're in this part of Missouri. These are our study areas, and there's 5 of them, but we're only going to cover the 4 here in the study, or in the talk. Diamond, Kickapoo, Providence, which is a pair, Taborville, Oconto, and in the most cases, compared to here in Nebraska or Great Plains, these are pretty small units. So we did come up with a decision trigger document. We had 2 work dogs, had some straw dogs, finally came up with this. Essentially from all this discussion on our plant community response decision triggers, we came up with 2 levels, 2 warning levels to help us kind of dictate if we need to review what we're doing or if we need to pause and review. Then we had some reports that came out, shared them with stakeholders. The report's kind of the background. You can't see it. There should be some orange stippling that kind of on the map to the right that kind of shows how that fire is moving across this per units. And then each report has this decision trigger table, which is a summary table of the plant community responses and then the graphs of how we're evaluating the plant community. So I'm going to skip that. We also had a structure one. So this is what the report looks like. First, some details on pasture and grazing. We're burning 1/3 per year, but stock cattle based on total acreages. They're normally dormant season burns, so between November and March, but they have differed in the year. Primarily using stockers, they're on for 90 days. And then most prairies are using a 3-graze patch cycle with 1 or 2 years of rest. Oconto prairie, it's a burn a patch, then rest a year. So how we're collecting data, we got a graze unit and a control unit, or an ungrazed unit. Within these units, we're designating high and average fluorescent plots. And these were chosen by Elizabeth and other botanists in MDC, but also the Institute of Botanical Training. Justin Thomas was selecting sites as well. Our high fluorescent quality areas were a 7 or greater, of 10 or more species within that plot. So within each unit, we had 20 high diversity plots, and then we had 20 average diversity plots. So here's Shannon, Simpson, your typical diversity indices. I won't cover those. Our stakeholders were primarily interested in mean C, interested in this, the coefficient of conservatism, the range of 0 to 10. That 7 to 10 value is highly conservative plant species. So on the figure on the right, you have 2 prairies. One has 8 species, but they're kind of common. So your mean C is a 2.25. On the prairie to the far right, you only have 3 species. One of those is milkweed. So your mean C is higher in that area. So stakeholders were interested in this. Then they were also interested in the proportion of conservative species within plots, and then the matrix species, those between 4 and 6. So this was our first warning level decision trigger. If the trend in mean C declines by 0.2 units, and I'll get to a unit, that's the unit change in mean C, over the first 5-year period on the grazed relative to the ungrazed, is either a decline, then a review of pasture and grazing on a unit will be conducted. If it drops by 0.5, then it's a pause and review. So once again, we wanted to set up 2 levels that would give us warning they weren't crossing some ecological threshold. And you can kind of view this 2 different graphs. The one on the left is, this is Justin Thomas, our contractor who was collecting the botanical data. It ranges from 5 to 2.5. High quality prairie is in this 5 to 4 area. And as you drop down, your prairie condition or quality degrades, and just a different view of it is on the right-hand side. So once again, those are our decision triggers for mean C. For the proportion, rather than unit, we're looking at proportion change. And these seem pretty easy right now, but these are really difficult to try to develop these decision triggers because our managers didn't want to say, yeah, we're fine with the declining 10% base 30%. It's hard to get people to commit to what they would be acceptable for a change. And then the matrix is the same, 10% for the warning level 1, 30% for the warning level 2. So the data was collected in June, July. Then we provided estimates and metrics and graph values and the trend lines, and then we tested with the NOVA. And this is, once again, this is for the diversity indices. Now, the graphs that you'll see, there are error bars, that's interannual variation, but really it's plotting a line to the 5 points. So we have 5 years of data, 2005 to 2019. 19. And then we have these tables that we, that we apply our decision triggers to. And we'll cover this real quick. There's 6 metrics, then there's 4 rows of questions. The first question is, are both trend lines positive? So if they are, the circles are the grazed area, the triangle is the ungrazed. If they're both positive, we don't worry about it. It's doing fine. So it's a yes, then we're not interested in the rest of the table. But if both of them are declining, we move to row 2. Row 2 are both trend line slopes of the grazed and ungrazed units. Is the grazed unit declining faster than the ungrazed unit essentially? So in this case, the triangles, once again, are the ungrazed, the circles are the grazed. Both are declining. Here's another example where the grazed is declining, the ungrazed is increasing. So if that happens, we calculate percent change or the change in mean C metric. So that's on the right side, so percent change. So in this case, it might be a 50% change, which would trip a decision trigger, and then we're also looking at statistical significance. And like I said, primarily we're going to be looking at mean C and the proportion of conservative species and matrix species in average and high areas. And quickly, how the graphs that you'll see are kind of set up is that you have, for each metric, either grazed or ungrazed. If it's a positive, it means they're both increasing. If it's a negative, it means it's decreasing. If it's S, it means it's stable, there's no change over time. If it's a red font with a box, it's something interesting. And if it's yellow, that means it tripped a decision trigger. So first we'll look at high diversity fluorescent points. And these are diversity indices. These are your species richness, Shannon's index, Simpson index. The main takeaway here is that they're all increasing primarily. So this metric is really not informative. This is not what our stakeholders are interested in because it's not looking at those high conservative plant populations. So in this case, these are those metrics: richness, Shannon, Simpsons are all increasing. That's the major trend. If you look at mean C, and remember we're looking at a drop in units for a warning level 1.2, 0.5 for a warning level 2. We're looking at average diversity fluorescent plots. We see that Diamond and Providence and Kickapoo tripped a trigger. Had something interesting happen at Taborville where the grazing was actually increasing, and then they were both declining on Wakanta. So here's a Diamond. So we tripped at decision level 1, the grazed and ungrazed units are both declining, but the grazed unit is declining by 0.3 points. So we tripped a trigger. However, it was not significant, but it could be a warning that, this might be something that we want to pay attention to moving forward. Maybe not change anything, but just realize that this could be happening. Providence Kickapoo, the same thing, had a 0.2 drop, ungrazed to grazed. Once again, it was not significant, but it's something to keep an eye on. At Taborville, it actually, the ungrazed was declining steeper than the grazed. If we look at the high diversity fluorescent plots, we kind of see the same trend for diamond. We see a decrease. Providence Kickapoo was increasing, and then Taborville and Waconta were both declining. Once again, we're interested in the decline, the difference between the grazed and ungrazed. So here the grazed and ungrazed units are declining. The grazed is declining faster at 0.3 units, but it's not significant. Once again, this is only 5 data points. Those error bars, don't pay attention to those. We're just placing a line between the 5 data points. And this is the one that's getting interesting where the grazed is actually increasing, ungrazed is declining. Similar trends with the conservative seeing metrics, where we are tripping a few triggers. Here, a negative 36 decline, which is tripping a trigger, but once again, it's not significant. So the same kind of pattern. I'll go through these a little bit quicker because I'm kind of running short on time. So the takeaway here with the diversity indices is that it's only 5 years of data. We were seeing some trip triggers that is concerning, but in this case, I probably would not change how we're doing pasture burn grazing related to these plant metrics. And I'll get through this real quick. So the last one is occupancy, and I won't belabor this, but I'll go to the results pretty quick. Our stakeholders were primarily interested in occupancy specific species. So they came up with 47 species to look at: decreasers, increasers, and grasses. So there's some of the species. Here, rather than looking at percent decline or change in units, we're looking at for significance, so a significant change. For warning level 1, at least one of the 3 decreasers that we were looking at had to be significant. For warning level 2, we had to have at least 2 or 3 significant. The tables are the same. Just at the top, we're looking at lead plant, coneflower, and sky blue aster. In this case, we did not trip any decision triggers. However, we did have a lot of negatives on the grade side. And at least to the question, once again, 5 years of data. If we look at the p-values, we see some of those pretty close. And it could be that maybe we're using too conservative a p-value with only 5 years of data. But if we look at the graphs, and this is where occupancy kind of breaks down for me, is that species that are rare, when you get close to 0 and 1, occupancy really doesn't, it kind of breaks down. So in most cases, all these occupancy species, the change is not great. I mean, it's saying a huge decline, but that's just a change in slope. But remember, it's kind of a small window that we're looking at. So a species drops out of 1 or 2 plots. It can have a big effect if it's closer to 0. But the big takeaway here is for these conservative plant species that we're interested in, these 3 at least, they're pretty much stable over time, and you don't see a lot of changes. So here's at Taborville, coneflower, sky blue aster. Whatever happened here between the difference between the grazed and the ungrazed happened before we started the study. We don't know what that is. But we can say within the first 5 years of this study that pasture burn grazing was not having a huge impact on these conservative plant species. Oh, and this is just another example. This is pale purple coneflower, Waconta prairie, grazed, ungrazed. So they're both right on top of each other. It's still showing that there's a decline. It's not significant. And this photograph here, on the right-hand side, we have some herp arrays set up that we don't want cattle to go into. And on the outside, we didn't. And it's kind of hard to see in this photograph, but there's all kinds of echinacea over here. The cattle hammered it outside. It was inside the burn. But once again, the pattern, we're not having a huge influence using pasture and grazing on these plant species. It's still concerning. Our stakeholders are still concerned. That's why we're doing a long-term study. We don't know what will happen in 10 years, 15 years, or over time. But at least for the first 5 years, what's more interesting about the study, and I won't have time to get into it, is that we weren't meeting our management objective on the structure side. Lots of things could be going on the structure side, why we weren't meeting those objectives. One, we have managers who are a little bit gun shy from all this controversy early on, that even within an adaptive management framework where you want to change and learn, do and learn and change to get better management objectives, we might have some managers that are a little bit gun shy to really push the envelope in terms of increasing stocking rates, changing burn time, burn season, burn frequency. I'm out of time.
Any questions? We'll let you questions real quick if there's anyone has a question.
Yes.
Have you done anything in the field to switch the negative attention to more of a positive? Any tours, anything like that, to showcase the work that you're doing?
We have, so the idea with collecting the data is that external stakeholders were a little distrustful, to be quite honest, of the MDC in the beginning, that we weren't sharing how we were making management objectives. And when Elizabeth started this study, we didn't want to put out any yearly data. We wanted to wait to the end of the 5-year period. A side note is that we were delayed in creating the decision triggers 7 years after we should have had them. And the only reason that this came about, this report, is that a couple of our prairie enthusiast groups, hey, MDC, where's our report about pasture and grazing? After that happened, we did create the reports, and we did have some study this summer. We had some visits out to some of our study areas to show people that things aren't disappearing. Additionally, I just touched on the reason I chose the plant side of it is that we don't hear a lot about plants. That graph that Sam had with pasture and grazing, there's no plant information in that. Some plant work has been done, but primarily it's the fauna that's kind of taking the attention. In Missouri, we're kind of backwards, where once again we have very passionate botanical folks that are really serious about their specific species, their specific prairie. So there's a lot that also goes into this whole project. But to get a roundabout to your question, at 5-year intervals, we'll get managers and external partners together, and we'll talk about how can we change the decision triggers. These decision triggers are weak, primarily because we didn't have the data, and also because we had, once again, fear among our internal, I say fear, but more apprehension among our internal folks about saying how much they would be acceptable with and losing on a native prairie. So now we have data we can work with, but we'll have both external folks and internal folks together. We'll discuss this. Ultimate decision will be made by MDC about how we're changing pasture and grazing, but we would have provided information and input from our external stakeholders how we can change. So, sorry, that was a roundabout.
No,
So, anyway.
So, we can talk more about this later. I'm a little concerned about the proportion thing, because you could have an increase in what botanists would consider weedy plants and no change in your conservative plants, which proportion would go down, right?
Right, but they will all still be based on the coefficient of conservatism.